The scorching sun beat down on Willow Lambert's porcelain skin as she reached for another apple, her slender fingers trembling with exhaustion after hours of harvesting in the relentless heat of the Texas summer of 1878. She had never known such fatigue could overcome a person so suddenly, like a thief stealing away her strength without warning. Willow had arrived in Sweetwater Springs just 3 weeks prior, leaving behind the comforts of her Boston upbringing to claim the small orchard her late uncle had unexpectedly left her. The locals had warned her about working during the hottest part of the day, but stubborn determination had pushed her to prove her worth in this unfamiliar territory. Just one more row, she whispered to herself, her vision blurring as dark spots danced before her eyes. The woven basket at her feet was only half full, mocking her diminishing stamina. The sweet scent of ripening fruit that had delighted her senses that morning now seemed cloying and overwhelming. Willow took a stumbling step forward, reaching for the branch above her head when the world began to tilt. The basket toppled as she fell to her knees, the carefully collected apples rolling across the dry earth. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a feeble whisper lost among the rustling leaves. Her last conscious thought was of how foolish she'd been to ignore the warnings about the treacherous Texas heat. Isaac Jenkins noticed the woman in the orchard from atop his chestnut mare nearly a quarter-mile away. He'd been riding the boundary of his cattle ranch when the flash of her pale blue dress among the trees caught his attention. At first, he thought nothing of it. The Lambert orchard had a new owner, some Eastern lady according to town gossip. But when he saw her collapse, an instinct born from years surviving the harsh frontier had him spurring his horse forward without hesitation. By the time he reached her, she lay motionless among fallen apples, her chestnut hair spilling across the parched ground. Isaac dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. Kneeling beside her, he noted the alarming heat radiating from her skin and the unhealthy flush across her cheeks. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. When she didn't respond, he glanced quickly around the orchard, spotting a small farmhouse in the distance. The woman needed shade immediately. The unforgiving summer sun would claim her life if he didn't act fast. With gentle care that belied his weathered appearance, Isaac gathered her limp form into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her toward the nearest apple tree with a substantial canopy. Once in the shade, he lowered her carefully onto the grass and removed his bandana, soaking it with water from his canteen. With practiced efficiency born from tending injured men on cattle drives, he placed the cool cloth against her forehead and neck, speaking in low, reassuring tones, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "You're going to be all right, madam. Just need to cool you down some." Willow stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of summer sage. Confusion clouded her gaze as she tried to make sense of the unfamiliar face hovering above her. "What happened?" she managed, her voice barely audible. "Heat got the best of you, I reckon," Isaac replied, relief evident in his voice. "Found you collapsed among your apple trees. You shouldn't be working midday without proper covering." Embarrassment colored her cheeks as awareness returned. I thought I could." She attempted to sit up but faltered, weakness still gripping her limbs. "Easy now," he cautioned, his hand steadying her shoulder. "Sun sickness isn't something to take lightly. I'm Isaac Jenkins, own the cattle spread that borders your orchard to the west." "Willow Lambert," she replied, struggling to maintain her dignity despite her disheveled state. "I appreciate your assistance, Mr. Jenkins, but I'm sure I can manage now." Isaac's expression remained serious, the lines around his eyes deepening. "No disrespect intended, Miss Lambert, but you can't even sit up proper. Your house looks to be a fair distance, and you're in no condition to walk there." Willow wanted to protest, to insist she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself after all. Wasn't that why she'd come west, to prove her independence? But as another wave of dizziness washed over her, she was forced to acknowledge the truth in his words. "Perhaps you could help me to the house," she conceded reluctantly. Isaac nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Let's wait until you're steadier, no rush." He offered her the canteen. "Small sips now." As Willow drank, she took the opportunity to study her rescuer. He wasn't what she'd expected of a Western cattleman. His clothes were dusty from the trail, yes, but well-maintained. His dark hair was longer than fashionable in Boston, brushing his collar beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, a deep indigo blue that seemed to hold both wariness and kindness in equal measure. "Thank you," she said after drinking. "I suppose I made quite the spectacle of myself." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No spectacle, madam. The Texas sun doesn't discriminate, takes down the toughest cowboys same as anyone else." They remained in the shade for nearly an hour, Isaac patiently waiting as color gradually returned to Willow's face. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the quiet assurance of a man comfortable with himself and his surroundings. He fetched the scattered apples, refilling her basket while she rested, and told her of the signs to watch for when heat threatened to overwhelm. When Willow finally felt strong enough to stand, Isaac supported her with a steady arm, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the necessary contact. The walk to her small farmhouse took twice as long as it should have, but he never rushed her, adjusting his long stride to her tentative steps. At the porch steps, Willow turned to thank him properly, surprised to find herself reluctant to see him leave. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along, Mr. Jenkins." "Isaac," he corrected gently. "And I expect you'd have managed somehow. Folks who come west usually have more grit than they know." He handed her the basket of apples. "Though, if you don't mind some advice, work the orchard in the early morning or evening. Midday sun out here isn't kind to anyone, especially those not raised under it." Willow accepted both the basket and the advice with grace. "I'll remember that." Isaac. His name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for such brief acquaintance, yet somehow right. He tipped his hat, those remarkable blue eyes meeting hers one last time, before he turned toward his waiting horse. "I'll check in tomorrow, if that's acceptable," he said, more statement than question. "Make sure you're recovered." Before Willow could form a proper response, he was mounted and riding away, leaving her standing on her porch with the curious sensation that something significant had just shifted in her carefully planned new life. True to his word. Isaac returned the following morning, just as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Willow, already at work in the cooler hours as he'd suggested, looked up from her harvesting to see him approaching on horseback, leading a second mount, a gentle-looking dun mare. "Good morning, Miss Lambert," he called, dismounting with easy grace. "Glad to see you took my advice about the timing." Willow straightened, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She'd spent extra time on her appearance that morning, though she'd never admit such vanity to herself. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins Isaac," she corrected. "I'm feeling much improved, thank you." His gaze assessed her critically, noting the healthy color in her cheeks and the steadiness of her movements. Only when he seemed satisfied did he gesture to the mare. "Brought you something that might help with your orchard work. This is Daisy, gentlest horse I own, and she's good with a cart. Thought you might use her to haul those baskets instead of carrying them yourself." Willow stared at him in astonishment. "You're lending me a horse?" "For as long as you need," he replied simply. "Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we all survive." The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely kind without any hint of condescension, that Willow found herself momentarily speechless. In Boston, such an offer would have come with strings attached, or expectations of repayment. Here, standing among her apple trees with the morning dew still glistening on the grass, it seemed a natural extension of the frontier code Isaac lived by. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "This is extraordinarily generous." Isaac shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's practical is all. You've got a good crop here. Be ashamed to lose it because the work's too much for one person." He paused, glancing around the orchard. "Though I'm curious what made a Boston lady decide to take on an apple orchard in Texas, if you don't mind my asking." Willow set down her basket, weighing how much to share with this man, who was still largely a stranger, despite his kindness. "My Uncle Henry left it to me," she began, deciding on honesty. "I'd never met him. He and my father had a falling out before I was born. When the lawyer's letter came after his passing, it was unexpected. But you came anyway," Isaac observed. "Most Eastern ladies would have sold it sight unseen." Most Eastern ladies haven't spent their lives being told what they can and cannot do. Willow replied with unexpected heat. She immediately regretted her candor. Forgive me, that was unnecessarily sharp. But Isaac didn't seem offended. Instead, a glimmer of respect flickered in his eyes. No need for forgiveness when you're speaking truth, Miss Lambert. Freedom to choose one's own path is something I understand well enough. There was a story there, Willow sensed, but before she could inquire further, Isaac changed the subject, offering to show her how to harness Daisy to the small cart he'd brought along. The next hour passed quickly as he patiently demonstrated the proper technique, his hands occasionally guiding hers through the unfamiliar motions. Each brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Willow that had nothing to do with the climbing morning sun. By the time they had Daisy properly hitched, Willow felt a new confidence in her ability to manage the orchard work. She also found herself fascinated by the contradictions in Isaac Jenkins, the obvious physical strength tempered by gentle patience, the frontier roughness alongside articulate speech that hinted at education beyond what she'd expected. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said as he prepared to leave. "You could join me for supper," he replied, then quickly added, "at the Cottonwood Inn in town, Saturday next. They serve a fine meal, and it would give you a chance to meet some of the local folks." The faintest color touched his tan cheeks. "Only if you're amenable, of course." Willow found herself smiling before she'd even considered the propriety of accepting. "I would like that very much." After Isaac departed, promising to return in a few days to check on both her and Daisy, Willow continued her harvesting with renewed energy. The mare proved invaluable, allowing her to transport full baskets to the small storage cellar without exhausting herself. As she worked, Willow found her thoughts repeatedly returning to the cattleman, his unexpected kindness, the respectful way he'd taught without patronizing, and most confusingly, the strange flutter in her chest when their hands had touched. Such feelings were entirely impractical, she told herself sternly. She had come to Texas to establish independence, not to develop an attachment to the first kind man she encountered. Yet, as the morning progressed into afternoon, she couldn't help but look occasionally toward the western boundary of her property, where Isaac's ranch lay beyond the rolling hills. The days that followed established a pattern. Isaac would ride over every third morning, ostensibly to check on Daisy, but increasingly to assist Willow with various tasks around the orchard. He fixed the sagging porch step without being asked, showed her how to repair fence posts, and taught her to identify the tracks of predators that might threaten her small flock of chickens. In return, Willow shared her knowledge of apple varieties, baked pies that earned his enthusiastic appreciation, and gradually revealed more of the life she'd left behind in Boston, her controlling father, the broken engagement to a banker's son who'd wanted a decorative wife rather than a partner, and her determination to succeed on her own terms. "You're braver than most men I know," Isaac told her one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant orange and purple. "Coming all this way alone, taking on this place with no experience." Willow smiled, feeling more at ease with him than she'd ever felt with anyone. "Or more foolish. I hadn't anticipated quite so many challenges." "Challenges build character," he replied, quoting something that sounded like it came from a book. "You sound like you've faced your share," she observed, seizing the opportunity to learn more about him. In all their conversations, Isaac had shared little of his own past, always steering the talk back to practical matters or her experiences. A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment, Willow thought he might deflect again. But after a long pause, he spoke quietly. "I came west after the war. Couldn't settle back into Virginia life after what I'd seen." "You fought for the Confederacy?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. Her family had been staunch Union supporters. "Fought for Virginia," he corrected gently. "But yes, wore the gray. Not something I'm proud of now, looking back with clearer eyes. War has a way of making everything seem simpler than it is." He met her gaze directly. "Would that change your opinion of me, knowing I stood on the other side?" Willow considered his question seriously. 6 years ago, fresh from the grief of losing her brother to a Confederate bullet, she might have answered differently. But the man before her now, with his quiet integrity and kind heart, seemed far removed from the faceless enemy she'd once imagined. "The war ended 7 years ago," she said finally. I think we've all done our share of growing since then. I judge you by who you are now, Isaac, not by a uniform you once wore." The relief in his eyes was palpable, though he merely nodded in acknowledgement. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, but something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding, a layer of reserve dissolved. By the time Saturday arrived, Willow found herself uncharacteristically nervous about their dinner in town. She'd seen little of Sweetwater Springs since her arrival, making only necessary trips for supplies. The prospect of being introduced as Isaac's what? Friend? Neighbor? The uncertainty added to her anxiety as she dressed in her best remaining gown, a sage green silk that complemented her eyes but seemed woefully out of place in frontier Texas. Isaac arrived precisely when promised, looking transformed from his usual working attire. His dark hair was neatly combed, his clean-shaven jaw revealing a strong profile she'd only glimpsed beneath his usual stubble. His suit, while not fashionable by Eastern standards, fit his broad shoulders well, and spoke of care in his appearance that touched her unexpectedly. His eyes widened appreciatively when she opened the door. "Miss Lambert," he said, the formality returning in his momentary discomposure. "You look, green suits you remarkably well." Willow felt her cheeks warm at the genuine admiration in his gaze. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." The drive to town in Isaac's wagon passed pleasantly, the early evening air perfect after the heat of the day. As they approached Sweetwater Springs, Willow's nervousness returned. "Will there be many people at the inn tonight?" "Saturday's usually busy," Isaac admitted. "But they're good folks mostly. Might be curious about you. Newcomers still cause a stir around here, but they'll be polite." Willow wasn't so certain. She'd felt the curious stares during her brief visits to the general store, heard the whispers that followed her. An unmarried Eastern woman running a property alone didn't fit neatly into frontier society. That she was now arriving in town with the most eligible bachelor in the county would surely set tongues wagging. The Cottonwood Inn proved to be more refined than Willow had expected, with clean tablecloths and proper glassware. The main dining room was indeed busy, and a momentary hush fell as they entered, followed by a buzz of whispered conversation. Isaac, seeming oblivious to the attention, guided her to a table near the window with a protective hand at the small of her back. Throughout the meal, various townspeople approached their table, ostensibly to greet Isaac, but clearly curious about his companion. He introduced her to each with easy courtesy, the doctor and his wife, the blacksmith, the banker, but Willow couldn't help noticing the speculative glances exchanged, particularly among the women. "Everyone seems very interested in your affairs," she observed quietly after the mayor's wife departed their table. Isaac's lips quirked in a half-smile. "It's not my affairs they're interested in. You're the most exciting thing to happen to Sweetwater Springs since the railroad came through last year." "Me?" Willow laughed. "Hardly exciting. A beautiful, educated Eastern lady taking on an orchard alone? Trust me, you've given them enough to talk about for months." His expression grew more serious. "Does it bother you? The attention?" Willow considered the question. "Not precisely bother. It's just, in Boston, I was practically invisible. One of countless unmarried women of a certain age, useful for charitable committees but otherwise overlooked. Here, I feel constantly observed, as though everyone is waiting for me to either succeed spectacularly or fail miserably." "And which do you intend to do?" Isaac asked, his eyes holding hers with genuine interest. "Succeed, of course," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "Though, I'm beginning to understand just how much I don't know about running an orchard." Isaac's hand moved across the table to cover hers briefly. "You'll learn. And you're not alone, Willow." "Not anymore." The simple statement, spoken so matter-of-factly, affected her more deeply than any flowery declaration might have. For the first time since her arrival in Texas, Willow truly believed she might make this new life work. Their evening ended with a slow drive back to her farmhouse under a canopy of stars, more brilliant than any Willow had seen in the east. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences that needed no filling. When they reached her porch, Isaac helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist, perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Willow said, suddenly shy beneath his gaze. "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his voice deeper than usual. "Perhaps we might make it a regular occasion." The invitation held more than a simple suggestion of repeated dinners, and they both knew it. Isaac was offering a courtship, as proper and traditional as circumstances allowed. Willow thought of her carefully constructed plans for independence, the determination that had brought her west, the promise she'd made to herself never to be defined by a man again. Yet, as she looked up at Isaac Jenkins, with his honest eyes and quiet strength, she realized that accepting his companionship need not mean surrendering her dreams. He had never once suggested she couldn't manage her orchard, had only offered assistance while respecting her authority over her own property. "I would like that very much," she answered finally. Isaac's smile transformed his face, erasing years of weathering and worry. For a moment, Willow thought he might kiss her, and a part of her hoped he would. Instead, he took her hand and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles, a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. "Until next time, then," he said softly before returning to his wagon. Willow stood on her porch long after his departure, her hands still tingling from the gentle pressure of his lips, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken since that fateful day in the orchard. As summer deepened into early autumn, the relationship between Willow and Isaac blossomed alongside her apple harvest. Their Saturday dinners in town became an established routine, supplemented by shared meals at her farmhouse and occasional picnics beneath the orchard trees. With each encounter, Willow discovered new facets of the cattleman that increased her admiration, his extensive knowledge of literature that matched her own, his patient teaching of frontier skills, his unwavering respect for her decisions regarding her property. News of a county fair in a neighboring town provided an opportunity for a different sort of outing. Isaac arrived early on a crisp September morning, his wagon freshly painted for the occasion, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. "These aren't nearly as beautiful as you," he said as he presented them, "but I thought you might like them anyway." Willow accepted the flowers with a smile that came easier each day. "They're perfect. Let me put them in water before we leave." The 12-mile journey to the fairgrounds passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation and shared anticipation. For Willow, who had attended only formal exhibitions in Boston, the country fair with its livestock competitions, handcraft displays, and carnival atmosphere was a delightful revelation. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted as they wandered among the stalls, her hand tucked into the crook of Isaac's arm. "Then we must make sure you experience all of it," he declared, leading her first to the agricultural displays where farmers proudly exhibited their best produce. Willow stopped suddenly before a table of apples, her eyes widening in surprise. "These are from my orchard," she exclaimed, recognizing the distinctive red-gold coloring of her uncle's special variety. The elderly man behind the table beamed at her. "You must be Henry Lambert's niece. He was mighty proud of these golden sunsets, won blue ribbons 3 years running. Told me to expect great things once you took over." "He knew I was coming?" Willow asked, confused. "But he died before I inherited the orchard." The old farmer chuckled. "Henry had his affairs in order long before his passing. Said his brother's girl had the right spirit for the place, even if she didn't know it yet. I'm Elijah Walker, by the way. Your uncle and I judged these competitions together for 20 years. As Elijah shared stories of her uncle, a man she'd never met, but who had apparently believed in her abilities, sight unseen, Willow felt a growing connection to both her property and the community she'd entered. Isaac stood quietly beside her, his presence supportive without intruding on this unexpected connection to her family history. "You should enter your apples next year," Elijah suggested as they prepared to move on. "Keep the Lambert tradition going." "Perhaps I will," Willow replied, surprised to find herself genuinely considering it. As they continued through the fairgrounds, Isaac purchased small treats for them to share maple sugar candy that dissolved sweetly on the tongue, crisp corn fritters still hot from the oil, and cups of fresh cider that reminded Willow she needed to learn about pressing her own apples soon. "I could help with that," Isaac offered when she mentioned it. "Got an old press in my barn that served me well enough for my small orchard. Nothing like your commercial operation, but it would get you started." "You have apple trees too?" Willow asked, realizing how little she knew about his property despite their growing closeness. Just a small grove, 20 trees or so. Planted them my second year here, once I had the cattle operation running smoothly. Always had a fondness for growing things, even as a boy. Willow tried to picture Isaac as a child, planting seeds and watching them grow. You never mention your family, she observed. Are they still in Virginia? A shadow crossed his face, the same one she'd noticed whenever the past arose in their conversations. My parents passed before the war, had a younger brother who didn't come home from Gettysburg. I'm so sorry, Willow said softly, understanding his loss all too well. My brother William died at Cold Harbor. Isaac's eyes met hers, recognition of their shared grief passing between them. The war took too many good men from both sides, he said quietly. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think of me now, raising cattle in Texas of all places. He always said I had too much education to waste my life farming. And did you? Have much education, I mean. 2 years at William and Mary before the war interrupted. Enough to know what I'd missed when I couldn't go back. He shrugged. Doesn't matter much out here anyway. A man's judged by what he can do, not what he's read. Yet you keep a shelf of books that would impress any Boston parlor, Willow countered, having noticed his well-stocked library during her one brief visit to his ranch house. Dickens alongside cattle breeding manuals, Shakespeare next to surveying texts. Isaac smiled, the somber mood lifting. Caught me out, did you? Yes, I still read when time allows. The mind needs cultivation, same as any field. Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement of horse races beginning at the far end of the fairgrounds. Isaac's eyes lit with boyish enthusiasm. Would you like to watch? My foreman has entered our best quarter horse. The races proved exciting, with Isaac's ranch horse placing a close second. As they cheered alongside the crowd, Willow found herself swept up in the communal joy of the event. In Boston, she had always felt like an observer of life rather than a participant. Here, with Isaac's arm casually around her shoulders and friendly nods of recognition coming from people she'd met through him, she felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. As afternoon faded toward evening, musicians set up a platform for dancing, and lanterns were strung to illuminate the area. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, and couples began to form sets for a country dance. Would you do me the honor? Isaac asked, extending his hand with a formal bow that made Willow laugh. I'm afraid I don't know these dances, she admitted. They're quite different from Boston ballrooms. I'll teach you, he promised. It's mostly about keeping time and following your partner's lead. Willow allowed herself to be guided onto the makeshift dance floor, quickly discovering that country dancing involved much more energy and considerably less rigid formality than she was accustomed to. Isaac proved an excellent teacher. His hand firm at her waist as he guided her through the steps, his eyes never leaving hers. As they whirled through a particularly energetic reel, Willow felt a freedom she'd never known in the staid Boston assemblies of her past. Her cheeks flushed with exertion and enjoyment, her carefully arranged hair coming loose from its pins, and she found she didn't care in the slightest. When the music finally paused and Isaac led her to the edge of the floor for refreshment, she was breathless but exhilarated. That was wonderful, she exclaimed. So much more enjoyable than the quadrilles and waltzes I grew up with. Isaac handed her a cup of cider, his own face flushed with pleasure. You're a natural. Wouldn't have guessed you'd never done it before. An excellent teacher makes all the difference, she replied, holding his gaze. The fiddler struck up again, this time a slower, more melodic tune. Isaac set aside their cups and held out his hand once more. This one's easier, he promised. More like your Eastern waltzes, I expect. The dance was indeed simpler, allowing couples to converse as they moved. As Isaac guided her in a gentle circle, his hand warm against her back, Willow became acutely aware of their physical closeness. In Boston, such proximity would have been scandalous without a proper introduction and chaperone. Here, beneath the Texas stars, with lantern light casting golden shadows across Isaac's face, it felt perfectly right. What are you thinking about? He asked softly, noticing her distraction. How different everything is here, she answered honestly. The rules, the expectations, me. Different better or different worse? Willow considered the question. Just different. In Boston, I always felt I was playing a part written by someone else. Here, I'm writing my own story, even if I'm not always sure what the next chapter holds. Isaac's hand tightened slightly at her waist. And do I have a place in this story you're writing, Willow? The directness of his question took her breath away more effectively than any dance. For a moment, they swayed together without speaking, the music washing over them as Willow searched for the right words. I think perhaps you've already written yourself into it, she admitted finally. That day in the orchard, when you carried me to the shade, it changed something, started something. She looked up at him, vulnerability and courage mingling in her expression. I didn't come to Texas looking for this, whatever is happening between us, but I find I'm not at all sorry that I found it. Isaac's eyes darkened with emotion. Nor am I, not for a single moment. His gaze dropped to her lips, and Willow knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to kiss her. Before he could act on the impulse, the music ended and applause broke out around them. The moment of intimacy shattered, leaving them standing close, but separated by the renewed awareness of their public surroundings. Perhaps we should start back, Isaac suggested, his voice rougher than usual. It's a long drive, and you have an orchard to tend in the morning. The journey home was quieter than their earlier trip, a new awareness humming between them like electricity before a storm. When they reached Willow's farmhouse, Isaac helped her down from the wagon with the same care he always showed, but his hands lingered at her waist, reluctant to release her. In the silver moonlight, with only the whispering leaves as witnesses, Willow made a decision that would have scandalized Boston society. She reached up and touched Isaac's cheek, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "For everything." Isaac turned his face slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers racing up her arm. "Willow," he began, his voice husky with restrained emotion. She rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips gently to his, answering the question he hadn't fully asked. For a heartbeat, Isaac remained perfectly still, as though afraid any movement might break the spell. Then his arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as he returned her kiss with tender reverence that gradually deepened into something more powerful. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I carried you to the shade," he confessed. Willow smiled, feeling remarkably untroubled by her own boldness. "I'm glad you waited. Some things are better when they arrive at the proper time." "And this is the proper time?" he asked, his arms still holding her close. "I believe it is," she answered, "though propriety would suggest you should be leaving now, before my reputation is entirely ruined." Isaac chuckled but released her reluctantly. "Far be it from me to damage a lady's good name." He took her hand, pressing another kiss to her fingers. "May I call on you tomorrow?" "I would be disappointed if you didn't," Willow replied. As she watched him drive away, Willow touched her lips, still tingling from his kiss. The orchard around her seemed charged with possibility, as though the very trees approved of this unexpected turn in her carefully planned independent life. The harvest season brought intensified work for both Willow and Isaac, limiting their time together, yet somehow deepening their connection through shared purpose. Isaac arranged for several local boys to help with picking the apples, teaching Willow how to manage hired hands, when to push for more effort, and when to recognize honest fatigue. In return, she assisted with his cattle roundup, proving surprisingly adept at keeping records and organizing the complex logistics of moving livestock to market. Their courtship progressed with a blend of frontier practicality and romantic sentiment that suited them both. Isaac brought small gifts, hand-carved combs for her hair, books he thought she'd enjoy, wildflower bouquets gathered during his rides, while Willow expressed her affection through carefully prepared meals and knitted items for the approaching winter. As October's chill crept into the air, they settled into a comfortable routine of shared work and stolen moments of tenderness. The orchard yielded a bountiful harvest under their combined care, exceeding Willow's most optimistic projections. With Isaac's guidance, she learned to press cider, preserve apple butter, and prepare the trees for the coming winter. "You're a natural at this," Isaac observed one evening as they sat on her porch, reviewing the season's accounts. "Your uncle would be proud," Willow smiled, warmed by the praise. "I'm still learning. Without your help, I'd have made a dozen costly mistakes. You give me too much credit. The knowledge was always in you, you just needed time to find it. He reached across the small table to take her hand. Which reminds me of something I've been meaning to discuss with you. The seriousness in his tone made Willow sit straighter. Is something wrong? Not wrong, he assured her quickly. Just, winter's coming, and your house needs work before the cold sets in properly. The north wall especially, I noticed cracks in the plaster that'll let in drafts something fierce come December. I've been meaning to hire someone to look at it, Willow admitted. There's a list of repairs I should address before winter. Isaac nodded thoughtfully. I could do most of them myself, save you the expense. But there's another option worth considering. He paused, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. The thing is, Willow, my ranch house is solid built to withstand Texas winters proper. It's also sitting half empty, with rooms going unused. Willow's breath caught as she realized what he might be suggesting. Isaac, I'm not proposing you abandon your independence, he said quickly. Your orchard is yours, and I'd never ask you to give it up. But perhaps we could consider joining our properties. Officially. He squeezed her hand gently. What I'm trying to say, probably poorly, is that I love you, Willow Lambert. Have since that day I found you in the orchard sun, and if you'd consider it, I'd be honored to have you as my wife. The declaration, though not entirely unexpected given the progression of their relationship, still left Willow momentarily speechless. 6 months ago, she'd arrived in Texas determined to prove she could succeed without a man's assistance or protection. Now, she was contemplating marriage to a cattleman she'd known barely 3 months. Yet as she looked into Isaac's earnest blue eyes, Willow recognized that this wasn't the surrender of her independence she'd once feared marriage would be. Throughout their courtship, Isaac had supported her ambitions for the orchard, respected her decisions, and treated her as an equal partner in their shared enterprises. Before I answer, she said carefully, I need to be certain of something. The orchard, it would remain mine. I'd still make the decisions regarding its operation. Of course, Isaac replied without hesitation. I'd help when asked, same as now, but it's your legacy. I wouldn't dream of taking that from you. And if I wanted to expand it, perhaps plant more trees next spring? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I'd say you're already thinking like a proper Texas orchardist. We could look at that south field that gets good morning sun. The we in his statement warmed her more than any declaration of affection might have. This was a true partnership. He was offering marriage as an alliance of equals, rather than the subjugation she'd feared in Boston. In that case, Willow said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Yes, I will marry you. Isaac Jenkins. The joy that transformed his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Isaac rose from his chair and pulled her gently to her feet, gathering her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey. You've made me the happiest man in Texas, he murmured against her hair before capturing her lips in a kiss that spoke volumes about his feelings. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Willow rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. When shall we be married? She asked. I'd prefer not to wait too long. Isaac chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly beneath her ear. Eager, are we? Willow felt a blush warm her cheeks, but didn't deny it. Winter will be here soon, and those repairs you mentioned do sound urgent, she said with mock seriousness. Well then, for the sake of proper home maintenance, perhaps next month, give the town something to talk about before Christmas festivities take over. Next month sounds perfect, Willow agreed, lifting her face for another kiss that sealed their agreement more effectively than any written contract. News of their engagement spread through Sweetwater Springs with remarkable speed, generating a flurry of well-wishes and, Willow suspected, a fair amount of relieved gossip that the Eastern lady and the bachelor rancher were finally making their relationship official. The women of the town, who had initially regarded her with polite curiosity tinged with skepticism, now welcomed her warmly into their circle, offering advice on frontier housekeeping and the management of a ranch household. As the wedding date approached, preparations intensified. Isaac's ranch hands, under the supervision of his foreman Jacob, undertook a thorough cleaning and refurbishment of the main house, while Willow divided her time between winterizing her orchard and assembling the modest trousseau her limited circumstances allowed. "You don't need to bring anything but yourself," Isaac assured her when she fretted over her lack of proper household linens. "The house is fully furnished, has been since my mother sent a wagon load of family pieces when I built it." "But I should contribute something," Willow insisted. "I don't want to arrive empty-handed like some charity case." Isaac's expression grew serious. "Is that what's truly bothering you? That people might think you're marrying me for security rather than affection?" Willow hesitated, surprised by his perception. "Perhaps, in part," she admitted. "In Boston, marriages are often evaluated by what each party brings to the union. My lack of substantial dowry was one reason my previous engagement was difficult." Isaac took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "This isn't Boston, Willow. Out here, a woman who can manage an orchard, keep accounts, and still bake the finest apple pie in 3 counties brings plenty to a marriage. Besides," he added with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, "you're forgetting that you own valuable property. If anything, folks might wonder what you see in a simple cattleman like me." His words eased her concerns, and as their wedding day dawned clear and crisp in late November, Willow found herself filled with anticipation rather than the anxiety she'd expected. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held in the small church in Sweetwater Springs, with seemingly the entire county in attendance. Willow wore a new dress of deep blue silk, a shade chosen to match Isaac's eyes, ordered specially from Dallas, and arrived barely 2 days before the wedding. As she walked down the short aisle on the arm of Elijah Walker, who had graciously offered to stand in for her absent father, she kept her gaze fixed on Isaac's face, drawing strength from the love and admiration she saw there. The traditional vows took on new significance as they exchanged promises to love, honor, and cherish one another. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac's kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience, yet conveying his devotion clearly enough to bring a blush to Willow's cheeks. The celebration afterward at the Cottonwood Inn was more boisterous than any Boston wedding reception Willow had attended, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Isaac kept her close throughout, his hand often finding hers or resting lightly at the small of her back, as though reassuring himself that she was truly his wife at last. As the festivities continued into the evening, Isaac leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Ready to see your new home, Mrs. Jenkins?" The title sent a pleasant shiver through Willow. "Yes," she replied simply. They made their farewells amid good-natured teasing and departed in Isaac's wagon, now decorated with ribbons and bells by his mischievous ranch hands. The journey to the ranch took longer than usual, with Isaac driving at a measured pace that gave them time to absorb the momentous change in their relationship. "Are you happy, Willow?" he asked, as they passed the darkened buildings of her orchard, now technically their orchard, though true to his word, Isaac had insisted her property remain in her name alone. "Completely," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. Though perhaps a bit nervous, Isaac's arm tightened around her. "About tonight?" Willow nodded, grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. Her mother's pre-wedding advice had been typically vague and unhelpful, speaking of wifely duties to be endured rather than enjoyed. Yet the passion she'd glimpsed in Isaac's kisses suggested there might be more to marital relations than her mother had implied. "We have all the time in the world," Isaac said gently. "Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." His understanding only increased her love for him. By the time they reached the ranch house, illuminated with welcoming lanterns left by the hands who had tactfully made themselves scarce, Willow's nervousness had transformed into anticipation. Isaac insisted on carrying her across the threshold in proper tradition, setting her down gently in the entrance hall that somehow seemed both familiar and new now that she would be calling it home. A fire burned cheerfully in the main parlor, casting warm light over the polished wood and comfortable furnishings. "Would you like a tour?" Isaac offered. "Or perhaps something to eat? Jacob's wife left a cold supper in the kitchen." Willow shook her head, summoning her courage. I'd like to see our room." Isaac's eyes darkened at her words. Without further comment, he took her hand and led her up the stairs to the master bedroom, where more evidence of thoughtful preparation awaited. Fresh linens adorned the large bed. A vase of dried wildflowers graced the dresser, and her trunks had been delivered and placed discreetly along one wall. "I had the hands bring your things over yesterday," Isaac explained. "Thought you might want to arrange them yourself, but there's plenty of space in the wardrobe and drawers." He hesitated, suddenly seeming as nervous as she felt. "If there's anything else you need or want changed, just say the word. This is your home now, too." The simple statement, delivered with such earnest sincerity, dissolved the last of Willow's apprehension. She stepped closer to her husband, how strange and wonderful to think of Isaac in those terms, and placed her hands on his chest. "It's perfect," she assured him. "Everything is perfect." The kiss that followed began gently but quickly deepened into something more urgent. Months of restrained desire finally finding expression. Isaac's hands moved reverently over her, learning the contours of her body through the silk of her wedding dress with a patience that both soothed and inflamed. When he finally helped her with the intricate fastenings of her gown, his touch was sure but unhurried, giving her ample opportunity to guide or halt his progress. No such intervention was necessary. In the warm glow of the bedside lamp, Isaac's expression as he beheld her in her thin chemise held such profound admiration that any lingering shyness evaporated. His own disrobing was less ceremonious, but no less affecting, revealing the strong body she'd glimpsed hints of during their work together, but never fully appreciated until now. What followed was a discovery more profound and joyful than anything Willow's mother's cryptic warnings had suggested. Isaac proved as considerate and attentive in this most intimate aspect of marriage as he had been in all others, guiding her through unfamiliar sensations with tender patience until pleasure overcame uncertainty. Afterward, cradled in the protective circle of her husband's arms, Willow felt a sense of completion she'd never imagined possible. The independence she'd sought in coming to Texas hadn't been surrendered, but rather transformed into something stronger through sharing it with a true partner. "What are you thinking?" Isaac murmured against her hair, his voice drowsy with contentment. Willow smiled in the darkness, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "That I'm extraordinarily glad I collapsed in that orchard." Isaac's chuckle rumbled pleasantly beneath her ear. "As am I, though I'd have preferred to meet you under less alarming circumstances. Would you still have fallen in love with me if we'd met normally, at church perhaps, or in town?" "Instantly," he assured her without hesitation, "though I might not have had the excuse to carry you in my arms quite so quickly." Willow laughed softly. "You're very good at that, you know, the carrying." "One of my many talents," he agreed with mock solemnity. "Useful for rescuing damsels overcome by orchard sun. And for crossing thresholds," she added. "Do you suppose we'll have other occasions for it?" Isaac shifted to look at her in the dim light, his expression growing more serious. "I certainly hope so. Perhaps when our family grows?" The question contained within the statement hung between them, important enough to address directly. "I would like children," Willow admitted. "Not immediately, perhaps I'd like some time to learn how to be a wife before becoming a mother. But yes, eventually." The relief in Isaac's smile told her he'd been uncertain of her answer. "I'd like that too, a house full of little ones with your spirit and determination." "And your kindness," Willow added, touching his cheek gently. "And your eyes. I'm quite fond of your eyes." "Is that so?" Isaac murmured, pulling her closer. "What other parts of me have earned your approval, Mrs. Jenkins?" The playfulness in his tone made Willow bold. "Several," she replied archly. "Would you care for a detailed inventory?" His laugh was quickly smothered by her kiss, and conversation gave way to more eloquent expressions of their newly formalized union. The following months brought adjustments as Willow and Isaac learned to blend their separate lives into a shared existence. The transition proved smoother than either had anticipated, their working partnership providing a solid foundation for their marriage. Winter's chill gave them ample excuse for cozy evenings by the fire, reading aloud from favorite books, or planning improvements to both ranch and orchard for the coming spring. Christmas brought their first true test as a couple when Isaac's widowed aunt arrived unexpectedly from Virginia, bringing with her distinct ideas about a proper household and a wife's duties. "You spend far too much time concerning yourself with business matters," Aunt Eleanor informed Willow after observing her reviewing the orchard accounts one evening. A husband doesn't want to come home to a wife with ink-stained fingers and distracted thoughts. Before Willow could frame a suitably polite response, Isaac spoke from the doorway where he'd been listening unnoticed. Actually, Aunt Eleanor, I find my wife's capable management of her business extremely attractive. Those ink-stained fingers you mention have doubled the orchard's productivity in a single season. The older woman sniffed disapprovingly, but offered no further comment on the matter. After her departure in early January, Isaac apologized for his relative's outdated views. She means well, he said as they prepared for bed. Her generation was taught that a woman's only value lay in her domestic abilities. And what do you believe? Willow asked, watching his reflection in the dressing table mirror. Isaac met her gaze in the glass. I believe I married a remarkable woman whose value can't be measured by any single quality. Your skill with accounts and apple trees is as much a part of who you are as your talent for making perfect biscuits, or... His voice deepened as he moved behind her, hands settling on her shoulders. Your exceptional abilities in this bedroom. Willow leaned back against him, smiling at his reflection. You're very good for my confidence, Mr. Jenkins. Just stating facts, Mrs. Jenkins, he replied, bending to press a kiss to the sensitive spot below her ear that he'd discovered during their first night together. Further conversation was postponed as they celebrated their first month of marriage in the most satisfying manner possible. As winter gradually yielded to spring, Willow found herself increasingly drawn to the orchard. Though she had maintained oversight throughout the cold months, making regular visits to check on the dormant trees, the warming days called her back more urgently. Isaac, understanding her need to reconnect with her property, arranged for repairs to the farmhouse so it could serve as a daytime headquarters during the growing season. No sense letting it sit empty, he reasoned. This way you can work comfortably without rushing back and forth, and we still have our home together. The thoughtfulness of the gesture reinforced what Willow had come to recognize as the cornerstone of their marriage: mutual respect for each other's passions and priorities. Isaac never begrudged the time she spent among her trees, just as she supported his occasional long days riding the range with his men. March brought the first blossoms to the apple trees, transforming the orchard into a fragrant cloud of white and pale pink. Willow spent hours moving among the flowering branches, checking for signs of disease or damage, and making notes on expected yield. It was during one such inspection that Isaac found her, much as he had the previous summer, though under far happier circumstances. Beautiful sight, he called as he approached on horseback, the blossoms and the woman tending them. Willow smiled up at him, shading her eyes against the spring sunshine. Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Jenkins. What brings you to the orchard today? Isaac dismounted, leading his horse the last few yards to where she stood. Can a man visit his wife without a specific reason? He can indeed, she replied, accepting his quick kiss. But you have that particular expression that suggests you're up to something. Caught again, Isaac admitted with a laugh. I do have news, actually. Just got word from Jacob that the new apple press has arrived in town. Thought you might want to go see it before they deliver it tomorrow. Willow's eyes lit with excitement. The commercial-sized press had been her Christmas gift from Isaac, an investment in the orchard's future that would allow her to produce cider on a scale suitable for selling to the growing market in Dallas. Yes, absolutely. Let me just finish these notes. As she hurriedly completed her observations on the last row of trees, Isaac wandered a few steps away, examining a particularly abundant cluster of blossoms. Remarkable how much has changed in a year, he observed. Last spring, these trees bloomed with no one to appreciate them properly. Now, look at them practically showing off for their new mistress. Willow laughed at his fanciful description, but understood the sentiment behind it. The orchard had transformed from an inherited obligation into a beloved domain under her care. Just as she had transformed from a displaced Easterner seeking independence into a confident Texas orchardist with a loving husband and integrated place in the community. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly, tucking her notebook into her pocket. Stopping that day when you saw me collapse? Your life might have continued much as before if you hadn't. Isaac turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. Regret finding the love of my life? What an absurd question. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, taking her hands in his. Willow Jenkins, the day I carried you to the shade was the best day of my life. Though I didn't know it yet. Everything good I have now, our home, our future, the joy I find in each morning, all of it traces back to that moment. Tears pricked at Willow's eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at his heartfelt declaration. I feel the same, she whispered, though I was too stubborn to admit it for the longest time. Isaac smiled, releasing one of her hands to gently wipe away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Your stubbornness is one of your finest qualities, right alongside your courage, intelligence, and remarkable capacity for love. Willow rose on tiptoe to kiss him properly. Unconcerned about potential observers, let the apple trees witness their affection. They had, after all, played matchmaker in their own silent way. When they parted, Isaac kept an arm around her waist as they walked toward his waiting horse. I've been thinking, he said casually, about that south field we discussed. The soil tests came back favorable for apples. If you still want to expand the orchard, spring planting season is upon us. You remembered, Willow said, touched by his attention to her ambitions despite his own busy schedule with spring calving. Of course I remembered. Your dreams are important to me. He helped her mount his horse before swinging up behind her, his arms encircling her securely as he gathered the reins. So, shall we order those saplings? Jacob says the nursery in Dallas has some promising new varieties. As they rode together through the orchard, discussing cultivation techniques and harvest projections with equal enthusiasm, Willow leaned back against her husband's solid chest and offered silent thanks to whatever twist of fate had brought her to Texas. The independence she'd sought had been found not in isolation, but in partnership with a man who valued her strength rather than sought to diminish it. That evening, sitting on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades remarkably similar to her golden sunset apples, Willow took Isaac's hand in hers. I have news of my own, she said quietly, her heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I visited Dr. Morris in town yesterday. Isaac turned to her, immediate concern in his eyes. Are you unwell? You should have told me I'd have gone with you. Willow squeezed his hand reassuringly. Not unwell, just confirming a suspicion. She placed their joined hands gently over her still flat abdomen. We'll be welcoming a new Jenkins around harvest time. For a moment, Isaac seemed frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise over the plains, radiant and transformative. A baby? We're having a baby? Willow nodded, her own smile matching his. According to the doctor, yes. He says everything appears perfectly normal, though I should perhaps avoid climbing ladders in the orchard as my condition progresses. Isaac seemed not to hear the last part, too overcome with joy to process practical considerations. In a movement that had become beautifully familiar, he swept her into his arms and stood, cradling her against his chest. Isaac, what are you doing? Willow laughed, her arms automatically circling his neck. Carrying my wife, he replied simply. Just as I did the day we met, seemed appropriate for the occasion. As he carried her into their home, Willow reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. From a woman who had lost her strength beneath the orchard sun to a beloved wife and soon-to-be mother. Treasured not, despite her independence, but because of it. The Texas sun still burned hot during summer days, but Willow Lambert Jenkins no longer faced its strength alone. The shade she had once needed for survival had transformed into the shelter of shared love, a love born beneath apple trees and nurtured through seasons of growth, harvest, and renewal. And as Isaac gently laid her on their bed, his hand reverently covering the place where their child grew, Willow knew with absolute certainty that collapsing in that orchard had been the first step on the path to everything she'd truly wanted but never dared to dream of finding. When their daughter was born that October, with her father's indigo eyes and her mother's determined spirit, they named her Autumn Blossom Jenkins, a tribute to the orchard that had brought them together and the season that had given them their greatest joy. And in the years that followed, as the Lambert Jenkins orchards flourished and expanded under their combined care, The story of how a woman lost strength in the orchard sun and found both rescue and enduring love became a cherished family legend, passed down through generations who tended the same trees under the same Texas sky.